This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In Wednesday's video this week, I looked at Threshold, an old but powerful mechanic that has almost all of its cards in the same block. And I thought I would do that with the second video of the week too. This time around, we're looking at Suspend, which is found almost exclusively in Time Spiral block. Most of the time, when we see Suspend, it allows you to pay a discounted cost for a card in exchange for having to wait several turns for it to come into play. With Duskrider Peregrine here, for example, you pay only 2 mana for a 3/3 with flying and protection from black. That's an amazing deal. Basically, you pay for something in advance to get a discount, but then you have to wait for it to arrive, and it's kind of going to get there a little bit late. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have Suspend somewhere in the text box, and all that means there are 62 cards that could be considered for this video. I'll talk about the 10 that have left the biggest impact on tournament Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a Mythic Championship, a Mythic Invitational, a Pro Tour, a Players Tour, a Legacy Championship, or a Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Magic Fest or Grand Prix is worth 1 point. At number 10, it is Delay, the only card to appear on this list that doesn't actually have Suspend itself. Instead, Delay is a counterspell that uses the Suspend mechanic. It puts 3 time counters on anything that gets countered. That's a pretty strong counterspell for one generic and a blue, since it can counter any kind of spell. Sure, in the long run it will put you down a card because your opponent will eventually get their spell back, but buying yourself 3 turns is no joke, and in an ideal world, you might just win the game before it matters. It was played in Control decks in block, and it also has 1 point from Extended, where it was played in the sideboard of an Affinity deck. At number 9, it is Detritivore. It's part of a cycle of rares and planar chaos that all have Suspend, and they do something every time you remove a time counter. In the case of Detritivore, it destroys a non-basic land every time a time counter is removed. This works quite well with Detritivore, since its power and toughness are each equal to the number of non-basic lands in opposing graveyards. That might sound a little too specific of an effect, but most decks in most formats play lots of non-basic lands, so if you can find a way to get them in the graveyard, Detritivore can potentially be quite large. This means that Detritivore can both interfere with your opponent's mana base and potentially come down as a huge win condition. Detritivore gained most of its points in Time Spiral block constructed, but it also has 1 point in Standard, which came in a red-green ramp deck. At number 8, it is Riftwing Cloudscape. If you know me, you know I love creatures with Enter the Battlefield bounce effects, and this was one of my favorite cards to draft, both in original Time Spiral and in Modern Masters. If you suspend this on turn 2, you're getting a pretty crazy deal. 2 mana for a 2/2 flyer that bounces something is really good, even if you have to wait for a few turns. Something to note, by the way, about creatures with Suspend that is a little bit weird and not something you would assume about the mechanic, is that they gain haste when they come down. So that means the Cloudscape and Detritivore, for example, can attack right away when they run out of time counters. The Cloudscape was played in both aggro and control decks in block. In control, it could help slow your opponent down and maybe even give you a win condition, and in aggro, it could come down after being suspended and get your opponent's best blocker out of the way to allow you to swing hard at your opponent, including with the hasty Cloudscape. In Standard, it was played in decks that could get extra uses out of the powerful Enter the Battlefield trigger. This included Makeshift Mannequin Reanimation decks, as well as Revelark decks. Both of those could get the Cloudscape back from the graveyard pretty easily, and doing so at instant speed can be especially nasty. At number 7, it is Aeon Chronicler, which is part of the same cycle as Detritivore, and like that Lurgoyf, the Chronicler does something when it has time counters removed. In this case, it lets you draw a card every time you remove one of those counters, and like Detritivore, once it comes into play, its power and toughness are augmented by whatever it was doing while it was suspended. In this case, it has power and toughness each equal to the number of cards in your hand. It draws you an extra card every turn it's suspended, and then it can come down and be quite large. It was featured pretty heavily in block and standard control decks, which could use the Chronicler as a source of card advantage and, of course, as a win condition later on in the game. At number 6, it is Living End, which is part of a cycle of rare cards in Time Spiral block that don't actually have a mana cost. They are all reworkings of powerful cards from Magic's past. Living End is modeled after Living Death. Anyway, with most Suspend cards, you have the option of casting it from your hand for a lot more mana, but that won't be happening here in most cases. You would normally have to suspend this to use it because it has no mana cost. For a while, the limitation was enough that Living In didn't see any play. It didn't gain any points in Block or Standard, for example. However, a couple of years after Time Spiral Block, the Cascade mechanic came out, and that suddenly enabled people to cast Living In without having to wait around for time counters to come off of it. The Living In deck made its initial debut in Extended, and it was composed of a bunch of creatures with cycling and 3 mana cards with Cascade like Demonic Dread. The plan was to cycle away all those creatures until you hit one of your Cascade cards, at which point you would cast that card, and you were guaranteed to hit Living End because the deck didn't have any other cards with low enough mana costs for Cascade to hit them. At that point, you got all your cycled creatures back while also blowing up your opponent's board. I personally think Living In is one of the cooler and more interesting decks the game has ever seen. Over the years, it's gained points in both Extended and Modern, but it's been a while since its glory days, with its last points coming in 2017. In the years since then, Living In does have several top 16s in Modern, so it might be possible that it gains a few more points someday, but it isn't going to add a whole lot, I don't think. At number 5, it is Greater Gargadon. Suspend 10 is a lot, even for 1 mana, but the good news is that you sacrifice stuff to remove time counters from the Gargadon, bringing it down even earlier. It saw a bit of play in Block and Standard in the sideboard of red aggro decks, where it could be a pretty nice card to bring in against control decks that had board sweepers. In response, you could just sacrifice stuff to the Gargadon until it got down to 1 time counter, and then it would come down on your turn, presumably on an empty board. In Standard, it was also played in Revelark decks alongside Riftwing Cloudscape. The Gargadon could help you sacrifice your Revelark to trigger its ability, or it could help you sacrifice a creature with an Enter the Battlefield ability that you really wanted to trigger again. More recently, it's been played in Modern and Legacy Bridge from Below decks. These decks look to use that enchantment to make lots of zombie tokens in a hurry while they mill their library, and it also has lots of creatures who can come back from the graveyard. This allows the Gargadon to come down really early in the game, and that's a pretty scary thing. This works in the deck because you don't really give up any significant resources to make it happen, so even if the Gargadon is killed, you aren't in too much trouble. The fact it has haste when it comes down is important because it means a lot of the time it will at least represent some significant damage, even if the opponent kills it on their turn. Bridge from Below was ultimately banned out of Modern in 2019, and it wasn't because of Greater Gargadon, but the Gargadon Dredge decks were collateral damage of that banning, and they won't be gaining any points in Modern anytime soon as a result. At number 4, it is Lotus Bloom, which is part of the same cycle as Living End. Obviously enough, the Bloom is a suspendy version of Black Lotus. While not remotely close to being the best card in the game like its forebearer, Lotus Bloom does still pack a lot of power. After all, you still pay 0 mana for it. And while you may not get the mana until 4 turns later at the earliest, it's going to provide you with a big mana boost on that turn that will often allow you to pull ahead of your opponent. Lotus Bloom was used in ramp decks and Block, but in every other format, it's gained points in some kind of combo deck, like Storm. Storm decks seek to play a bunch of spells in a single turn and then fire off a card like Brain Freeze to win the game on the spot. These decks are generally interested in cheap spells that either produce mana or cantrip, which allows you to really get a crazy high Storm count. Lotus Bloom adds to your Storm count once you play it from exile, and then it gives you mana to help you chain a bunch of spells together. It's gained points in Storm decks in both Standard and Extended. In addition to Storm, the Bloom is also played in Modern ad nauseum combo decks, which don't look for a Storm count, but they do want as much free mana as possible to cast the eponymous spell, because when they do, they often draw their whole library and cast a bunch of stuff and win the game. Lotus Bloom is likely to continue to gain points in the future. At number 3, it is Search for Tomorrow, a ramp spell with Suspend. Paying 1 green mana for this on turn 1, and then getting an extra land on turn 4 is pretty great, especially because the land comes into play tapped. So you immediately reap the rewards of this ramp spell. While it can't quite keep up with the ramp of Eternal formats, it has been one of the best ramp spells around in several different formats. I'm sure it won't surprise you to hear that Search for Tomorrow has been played in various ramp decks in Block, Standard, Extended, and Modern, where it has been the most prolific. There, it's typically featured in Valakut the Molten Pinnacle decks, which are ramp decks that search for a combo win. Search for Tomorrow is going to continue to gain points going forward, but that's true of the 2 cards in front of it too. At number 2, it is Ancestral Vision, which is part of the same cycle as Living End and Lotus Bloom. It's a suspendy version of Ancestral Recall. Obviously, adding Suspend to one of the Power 9 makes it weaker, but it's still pretty amazing to only have to pay 1 mana to draw 3 cards, even if you have to wait for it to happen. If you can make it those few turns, your opponent will have a hard time beating the significant card advantage you obtain, especially because the turn you get that card advantage, you'll have all of your mana available to you. It has largely been played in control decks, which can usually make the game last long enough to reap the rewards of Ancestral Recall. In addition to control decks in Standard and Extended, it was also played in Fairy decks in both formats. It's gained the most points in Modern, and this is despite the fact that it was actually banned in the format from its inception in 2011 all the way until 2016. Since 2016, it's been played in control decks like Blue Moon and Blue White Control. Ancestral Vision has also been powerful enough for Legacy, where it's been played in a variety of different blue decks, with Shardless Bug being its most frequent home. And at number 1, it's Riftbolt, a sorcery speed lightning bolt with Suspend. Red burn spells that only cost 1 mana will always find a home in aggro and burn decks. They're incredibly efficient cards, and either allow you to kill a problematic creature, usually for a lot less mana than your opponent paid for it, or it allows you to accelerate your opponent's clock. This only has Suspend 1, so you don't even really have to wait that long for it to do its damage. Riftbolt has been played in burn and aggro decks in Block, Standard, Modern, Extended, and Legacy. It's going to continue to gain points, and it has a significant enough lead on Ancestral Vision and Search for Tomorrow that I think Riftbolt will remain the number 1 card on this list for the foreseeable future. Well, those are the 10 cards with Suspend that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you do, it increases the chances of other people enjoying it too. If you want to make sure you stay on top of new MTG Top 10s as they come out, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you need to catch up on the MTG Top 10s I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.